Hamatakiapi, good morning. This is Nick Estes. I am in Minneapolis and it's very snowy here. It's very lovely weather. We are joined today by our wonderful guest, Mohammed el-Kurd, who's been on the podcast. I think this is your third time joining us, but welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Today, we're going to discuss his book, Perfect Victims, The Politics of Appeal. This was published through Haymarket, I think last month it dropped. But before we get into this book, Mohammed, I was wondering if you could maybe take us back to where you were born and raised. A lot of, a lot of the context of your political consciousness, as you describe in this book, comes from your upbringing in Jerusalem and your experience as a child growing up, where you had people like the actual colonizer in your home, your actual settlers living in your house with you. So I was maybe wondering if you could just talk about that context of Jerusalem for our listeners and our viewers who may not know much about it, especially from the context of Palestine.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I grew up in what a Jerusalemite may consider like a normal, average Jerusalem neighborhood, which was the target of a dispossession ethnic cleansing campaign led by settler organizations that were registered as charities in the United States and New York, to be specific, that were collaborating or partnering with the Israeli military and the Israeli judiciary and the government to take us out of our homes under the pretense that these were like their God-given homes, that they had owned them before us, blah blah blah. And it's been like all of my life. I've only known, going back and forth from the courts and like being harassed by the settlers. But then when you zoom out from our neighborhood and from our house, you recognize that this pattern of displacement happens all over the map, all over Jerusalem, all over historic Palestine. In our case, it's kind of this fabricated real estate dispute, but in other neighborhoods like Silwan, which is a 10-minute drive from us, it is under the guise of like protecting archaeological sites that they're trying to displace Palestinians. Or if you go to South Hebron Hills to Masafir Yatta, it'll be framed as these Palestinians are living in military zones, and thus they must be expelled. But no one tells you that these military zones were designated for the sole purpose of expelling Palestinians. Um, so yeah, I think that growing up in that kind of violence was extremely formative for me and for my worldview. But I think there was always a need to have political education. This is why I didn't really want to start the book itself with the ethos of like who I am and where I grew up and stuff like this, because I do think lived experience is important, but I do think not anybody can be politically conscious without even the lived experience. You know.
But yeah, I see that, but also like your personal experience. I think people, if they think of colonization, they kind of think of it as like especially the recent intensification of genocide in Gaza. It's almost like a faceless, sort of distant, removed. And from what I understand from your experience and your family's experience, it's very intimate, actually. Like it's not something like you literally open your door and it's right there. The people who are literally colonizing your house are like right there, and that kind of creates a different perspective that I don't think people fully appreciate in especially like when they understand what this project is about. It's not just something that's like happening from afar. It's literally block by block, neighbor by neighbor, room by room.
Yeah, I mean the settlers know us by name. There's a moment that I'll never forget. I remember I think I was detained a while ago, and the police officers told me that they could see into our bedrooms. So the settlers really like have instilled themselves within every aspect of our lives, and they have done it in a way that is beyond invasive. It's you see the remnants of the settler even in your mind, in your own psyche, in your own like analysis, and how you talk to your family, and like what I would be in when I would go to school. My mother would instruct me not to put my hands in my pockets because she would be afraid that the settlers might think I have a knife and that they would shoot me, or the police would think I'd have a knife and they shoot me. She wouldn't allow us to, like, take forks in our bag, for example, because she was afraid that they could say this is a weapon. So yeah, there is this kind of intimacy that makes it all the more absurd. It makes it all the more absurd, and it makes it all the more also infuriating, because you see the settler right across from you, and you know that if you were to raise a finger in their direction, you would be shot by the police. So your hands are tied and you're furious, and it's quite an absurd scenario. And also you recognize that they feel righteous in what they do. They may know what they're doing is unjust, or that or like they may know, that these houses are not theirs, but they still believe that what they're doing is righteous, and they're operating in God's name, and that too is very absurd.
Yeah, I think there's, a good conversation to be had about how Palestinians aren't, especially in the West, um, aren't allowed to really describe their colonizers. And I think that's you get to a lot of that in this book, but it's difficult because their Jewishness, is conflated with their Zionism, and those become sacrosanct. You can't talk about that. And you have this essay. I think it's repurposed from an essay you published before about not being able to name your colonizer. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like how that really kind of structures not just the arguments you're trying to make in this book, but it almost makes it hard for you to even make legible like what is happening, because you can't even name the people without getting canceled, kicked out, arrested, beaten, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, we our houses were taken by explicitly Jewish organizations, Jewish American organizations, Jewish Israeli organizations. They're explicitly Jewish. If you look at any of the urban plans that the Israeli municipality is pushing in Jerusalem, the word Jewish appears through and through. And to take this to an extreme example, in 2023, I believe it was, a Palestinian guy was branded with the Star of David. Then we started seeing more and more people being branded with the Star of David, be it actually being like physically etched onto their skin, or like with a marker. We saw plots of land branded with the Star of David. We saw menorahs erect on top of like depopulated, ruined neighborhoods in Gaza. We see this through and through, and yet you're told not to make note of it, not to ignore it, to treat it as though it's a secret. But it's not a secret to our enemies. Our enemies use this to their advantage. They conflate their Judaism with Zionism to their advantage. They talk about themselves as the only Jewish state in the world, about themselves as a Jewish army. And for me, as an observer, to watch this, it's uh, it it's insane. It's insane, the demand to treat it as though it's a secret. It's insane because these people are Jewish, and me pointing out the obvious is not offensive. And it's not. I'm not saying they're bad because they're Jewish. I'm saying they're using their Jewishness to absolve them from accountability for their crimes, and that is a horrific but indisputable fact. And I really just wanted to name it in the book because I have this ethos, like this undeniable ethos, because there's quite literally Jewish settlers in my house. So you can't really argue with me. But the issue with this kind of like politeness, or the issue with like telling people that you must learn and acquire a new language in order to talk about your oppressor, is that it shifts the blame from the oppressor to the oppressed. It's victim blaming, essentially. I'm telling the victim, your house was taken, your house was demolished, your house was bombed. But in order for me to sympathize with you, I must first put you through like a test to see the kind of language you use, and then I would decide whether you're grievable, or whether you're condemnable, or whether I should stand in solidarity with you.
Yeah, and that's really the entry point into this book, I think, is to create this myth of a perfect victim, right? um I was reading a tweet. I can't remember. I think it was from Olivia Campus, or I can't remember her name. She's she's on Twitter, but she talked about one of the captives in Gaza as being kidnapped. This is the word she used: kidnapped from a tank along the perimeter fence. I don't know if you saw
It's
this,
not. That's hilarious.
but it's like you're literally encapsulated within an armored vehicle in an occupied territory, patrolling a security fence that's meant to contain people in what has been called the largest, open air concentration camp on earth. But yet you can still be kidnapped from a tank. Like this is the alternate reality that we're forced to live in terms of we can't even talk about facts like as they exist and objective facts. And that's really why I appreciated this book, not just for its intervention into the conversation around Palestine, but because of the conversation that it intervenes in around colonialism, because colonialism is always made to look like self-defense. Invasion is always made to look like self-defense. There's always a preemptive aspect to it, as you just named. We have to invade this Palestinian home, because they are inherently anti-Semitic, and their resistance and whatever they say to us is inherently anti-Semitic, so we can dismiss their claims. And so, from what I understand, your book is like is it's less about trying to convince people that this is a settler colonial projects that's premised on genocide. It's more written for progressives, I guess, people who may be sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, but want to create a perfect victimhood narrative. And this book has, I like it because it's not academic, in the sense that it's like, you don't, the citations, I mean, if you want to read the citations, it's great, but it's more polemical. It's really just laying out the facts, and really in a sort of irreverent way, kind of poking fun, and I think in a productive way, poking fun at these narratives. um but I just wanted to maybe ask you to describe what you see as best as you can. Like this is the topic of your book, but as best as you can, like maybe give an example of what this perfect victim narrative actually looks like, and how it plays out in practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think the example you brought up is very timely, the kidnapped from the tank, because it shows you that no matter what they do, they can always be excused for it. And no matter what we do, we will always be condemned for it. And this is why I think the perfect victim framework just simply doesn't work, because there is not an affect we can embody. There is not a behavior we can model after ourselves after that will absolve us from our status of being condemned. Meanwhile, they can do like Nazi salutes, and the ADL will say they're on edge. It's tense times. But if a student says "Free Palestine," then oh, they're calling for a second Holocaust. It's absurd. It's like warped colonial logic. But it's also, I think it's time for us to understand that by demanding the perfect, and to just like summarize for people who didn't read what I mean by perfect victim, and certainly this is not a new concept, but what I mean by perfect victim is somebody who like has a certain passport that allows them a certain advantage, or is disabled, and so they're seen as docile, or that they have a noble profession, like they're a medic, or a medic or a journalist, or they like are so pure, they're pure hearted, they would never hurt a fly. Their family was killed by Jews, but they love Jews, and they make sure to say that before they say anything about their family, because they don't want to be called anti-Semitic, and because they're not anti-Semitic. Just like a perfect individual that does not exist, and if he does exist, it's kind of an unattainable trait that throws the majority of other people under the bus, because most other people will respond to hatred with hatred. Most other people aren't highly trained, and aren't highly educated, and don't have the perfect script, and most other people are just regular people. And also, we don't want to forget that this framework also like demonizes and vilifies our fighters. And so when a Palestinian is killed, for example, it's not enough that the Palestinian was killed. We have to say that he was, disabled, or a journalist, or that he was on his way to his birthday or on his way to a wedding when he was shot and killed by the Israeli military. We have to editorialize the death to make it exceptional. Otherwise, the death, the killing, is business as usual. It's normal. And my argument, and I think this is a basic argument in theory. I think it's just hard when people start to test it out. But my argument is that simply this framework of shrinking yourself ever over and over again, shrinking yourself, of compromising, conceding to the demands made by your oppressor, will simply not work. And that dignity is a much more compelling and effective framework. And this is, a book, like you said, it's not academic. There's not lots of statistics. I wanted to exit the debate, and I wanted to talk about the nature of the debate itself, the Israel-Palestine debate, because it's not a debate. It's cross-examination. It's the Palestinians in the hot seat being questions about their intentions before we even address the material, systemic, and policy-driven violence that takes place against them in real time.
I think, in many ways, this book is about language and the policing of language. And you as a writer, you're a poet, you're a journalist, and how the politics of language, are incredibly important in this kind of this, I guess you could call it warfare, because this language can get you arrested. Again, there's consequences to the things that we say. It can get you arrested. It can get you fired. It can get you stopped at the border. It can get you secondary screening every time you travel in and out of the country. There's all these consequences to language, but there's also consequences to people. And I think you point this out really, poignantly. There's consequences to people who, for just existing, even without these various categories. If in some way the colonial system will find you in the end, whether you hug the oppressor, you cry on their shoulder, whatever, or you resist them, it'll find you. It's indiscriminate in the way that it seeks elimination as you as an enemy. And it was very kind of revealing to me, especially reading your really beautiful essay, I would say, on Shireen Abu Akleh, and just like how your refusal to talk about her passport, to talk about her citizenship, but then also I think the portrait that you paint of her funeral procession, and the the people that it brought together, and what that really represented. And I was wondering if you could maybe like recount that kind of scene in the book and that kind of argument, because I think it really gets to the heart of what you're talking about in your central argument.
Yeah, I think, Shirin Abu Akleh was like the ultimate perfect victim. Her death was such a shock for all of us. It was such a tragedy. I think we all remember where we were when we heard about it, because she was a giant in the Arab world. And despite her perfect victim status, despite her being a Christian and a woman and a journalist and being killed in a press vest and her carrying a U.S. passport, despite all of these things, justice is yet to be served. And if anything, it has only served her, more. It gave her maybe a little bit more noise, a little bit more attention than the average Palestinian martyr. But I argue that it's not like, if it doesn't serve justice, then it's not worth it. I obviously understand why people cite the US passport, because they know that the US government has a responsibility to go to great lengths to get accountability for its citizens. But I don't know if that has been true. In the case of Shirin Abu Akleh, in the case of Rachel Corrie, in the case of Omar Assad, in the case of many, many Palestinians who hold who hold American citizenship, or Americans. And I think the biggest issue that I take with this is that in creating this perfect victim, you kind of sever the person from their people. And I think, again, in the short term, maybe this is compelling to say, oh, she was an American and she was just a journalist. She had nothing to do with what was going on there. But Shirin Abu Akleh became a journalist to fight the occupation. She was not nonpartisan, because there is no such thing as nonpartisan under genocide, under settler colonialism. She became a journalist to fight the occupation. She was a member of Palestinian society. In 2002, when the Israelis raided Jenin refugee camp, she was there as a journalist, and then she dug with her bare hands, helping bereaved mothers look for their martyred children. This is a Palestinian woman, and in painting her as this, like, you know, bystander who was just there, you're also kind of implying that if you were there to fight the occupation, if you were there to throw a rock, if you were there without a press vest, if you were just a resident of the area, then somehow your death is justified. And I think that's a really problematic framework. And evidently, 20 days, I think, after she was murdered, another Palestinian journalist was killed. And not one human rights organization in the West talked about her because simply the Israelis said that she had a knife or that she was planning on doing a stabbing attack. And nobody wants to go to war for this, for the slain or defend the slain if the slain are an alleged assassin. And the question I try to raise is why not? Why not try to defend the assailant? Like what? Why not? Why not defend and fight against the occupation? Now, obviously, there is so much I could say because, like you said, there is lots of laws in this country and in other countries that would, render what I say to be seen as incitement or kind of get me in trouble. And we've seen this also recently in the recent wave of attacks on bookstores in Jerusalem by the Israeli military.
Yeah, you can't. It's illegal to humanize Palestine or Palestinians, or even the resistance. I think I the first time I ever really encountered this in my own life was when there was a police killing of Lorraine Sinigini. She was a Navajo woman in a place called Winslow, Arizona. And Austin Shipley was a white cop who had known her prior to their interaction, in which he ended up killing her, murdering her on the street in broad daylight. But he stopped her and shoved her, and she turned around and attacked him. According to his point of view, attacked him with a nail file that she had in her hand in self-defense. I mean, you could argue it was in self-defense because she's a 115-pound woman. He's a 200 plus, pound white man with a gun, armed with lethal and authorized with lethal force. But to portray that in the media to get sympathy for L'Oreal Sinigini, you have to say she's a 115-pound woman. She was, unarmed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, God help me if I don't defend myself or the people around me if I'm attacked in a similar way, but we can't humanize her. We can't grant her agency in her defense of herself. We can't, because to do so would be to, I guess, tarnish the image of her as a person, to say that she should have accepted her fate. She should have let him kill her without resisting. And we were even told by some politicians, but also some native politicians, that they couldn't support her case because of the way that the body cam footage had shown that she had potentially fought back. And I remember thinking about that for the longest time. It's like, so we can't, we're supposed to, like, somebody like Shireen, somebody like whoever it is, are supposed to exist in these kind of hermetically sealed context. Like, you're just supposed to be either be a civilian or you're supposed to be a terrorist. There's no in the eyes of the media, there's no kind of blending, and we can't have nuance is not granted to us, but we have to grant it to the colonizer. We have to say, this was somebody's 33-year-old boy was in a tank, hermetically sealed armored tank, and then was taken and victimized. And I think when I was thinking about this perfect victim narrative, it also victimology applies to the colonizer as well. And I was wondering if you don't really get into that in this book, but in some ways, by creating perfect victims of people, like of Palestinians, there's also a mirrored kind of response of like what is a perfect victim as a settler, and I was wondering if you could maybe like think about that in the context of this book, because everything that's all violence perpetrated against Palestinians is in the name of self-defense, right?
Yeah. I think this is a really interesting and compelling exercise, like thought exercise, because I haven't thought about it, but you're right. The settlers are in a lot of ways perfect victims. I think the difference is, first of all, the reception, or the hunger to receive them as victims. It doesn't take much, and because it doesn't take much to see the colonizer as victims, their victim narratives are kind of blind to their own absurdity. you know they lack the self-awareness, be it like, oh, he was kidnapped from a tank, or like when we're talking about soldiers who are dancing outside of a concentration camp where 2 million people live besieged, um, and saying that they just wanted to dance. There's something comical and macabre about how blind they are to the absurdity of their narrative. But because again, the world is set up to it's set up to believe them. We saw BBC and CNN and so on refer to like Palestinian children as men, and like Palestinian like 5-year olds as young ladies, and we saw them also refer to soldiers in military fatigues has like boys kidnapped, and it's unbelievable.
Yeah, I think about this term victimology because even in the context of like native studies, or I do American Indian studies, that also becomes, when we talk about things like genocide, like the Genocide Convention, it has to meet these criteria of victimhood, right? And resistance is a category that is often I guess sidelined for larger questions of whether or not these people were actually perfect victims in the terms of how they received the colonial project. And even resistance itself, when it is talked about in the context of native people in North America, in the continent of North America, we can never be victors. We always have to be tragic losers. So even I do this exercise of looking at media portrayals of indigenous resistance fighters in history, and they were absolutely demonized. They were called terrorists. That language actually came in the English vocabulary, came primarily from the way they talked about indigenous people in this continent. Fast forward 100 years after we are, quote unquote, subdued by the settler, they are then valorized and romanticized as sort of tragic figures. So they have it both ways. You can talk about resistance only in context if you're going to lose, and be, and victory is achieved by the settler. But then you also see this in the narratives that are portrayed. So I haven't seen this new film. I can't remember what it's called. I just blanked on the name, but it won, an Oscar, and it was, yeah, No Other Land. And I haven't seen it, so I can't comment on the context. I can't comment on what is actually in the film. But I did read some critiques by one of my friends, and Mary Turfa. She talks about, I think she even uses your work to talk about that film, that it's elevated to a level of legitimacy and acceptability because it is paired with between a settler and a native, right, who become the kind of the face of the film. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that kind of cultural aspect and production, about what becomes legible and acceptable in terms of how Palestinian victimhood, but also resistance, like whether it's an act of resistance through, physical armed confrontation, or whether it's through the narrative that's supposed to be being portrayed.
I think what you said about people being valorized in the past tense is so timely, because this is what's going to happen. And just if one is a student of history and looks at like Native American history, you're able to see this, that in the Palestinian future there will be museums, and there will be land acknowledgements, and there will be like romanticization of the freedom fighter by the very people that demonize him today. And that is like something to consider, particularly in the ecosystem of our knowledge production today. I mean, a film like No Other Land, I think the biggest issue with it is that it distracts entirely from the point that it is trying to address by simply being a co-directed film. No one, I think, not the people celebrating the Oscar win and not the people who are content, who are mad about it, can tell you succinctly what is going on in Masafer Yatta. They couldn't tell you that in the 80s, the Israeli government designated these lands as military zones for the sole purpose of expelling their residents, that that it's about 22 villages, that about 1,300 people now risk the possibility of being displaced. They wouldn't tell you about the fact that school children walk to school and sometimes are mutilated by leftover explosives left over by the military. The thing about the main topic at hand is that this is a co-directed thing, and it kind of like satisfies this urge in the viewer who's like so fed up with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, quote unquote, and they want it to come to an end. Their people are used to happy endings, and they want happy endings, and so they see this like um, friendship between the settler and the native, and it like satisfies in them this like super selfish need for an easy solution, and they ignore the nuance, they ignore everything, and they watch it, and they but a lot of people were rightfully pointing out the power imbalance between the settler and the native, but I think there's even a more troubling power imbalance, which is, even whether this is in Masafer Yatta or in Sheikh Jarrah or in Silwan, Palestinians find themselves in the positions of advocacy. We're not professional. Most of us are not professional activists. We are bereaved because our family was killed or our house was demolished or whatever. And then the press comes, and then you are forced into this position of the spokesperson. And most of the time, you don't have the language, you don't have the tools, you have the experience. But Israelis, like that Israeli filmmaker, they migrate from Tel Aviv, they make the pilgrimage from Tel Aviv to our villages, and they can set up camp for 6 months on end because they have the economic advantage, because also they have an intellectual interest in what's going on. They have an interest. It's compelling to them. They're activists. They're people who are interested in political science, who are, you know what I mean? So there's that power dynamic where this is framed as like a film that is made by two filmmakers, but it's not. Clearly, one person in the equation controls the narrative and is able to hijack the narrative. And this is not just about this film. It's about the entire genre or the entire industry of this co-resistance, because most of the times Palestinians are doing it in spite of themselves, and for the Israelis, it's a lot of the time it's part of their self-discovery, it's part of their self-improvement, and that creates an insane imbalance of power and asymmetry, and who gets to decide the language and who gets to decide the narrative, and it kind of creates this um, world in which the problem is with certain bad settlers, not with settler colonialism as a whole, because you have now good settlers and bad settlers, and so the settler colonial project can somehow, in the viewer's mind, be absolved, be rehabilitated, be redeemed, as long as there were more good settlers.
Hmm. Yeah, you brought up some interesting points, and I think there's a lot of parallels with indigenous people, especially when it comes to we call it the experts. We can never be an expert on our own suffering or our own condition or our own aspirations or our own dreams. They always have to be validated by mostly white people, right? Like our white experts. We have the white historians who come to our land cases. We have the white anthropologists who prove that we believe X, Y, and Z thing, or that we have the archaeologists come in and say, yeah, they were actually here, or they weren't here. But none of our stories, none of our evidence, becomes legitimate. And then we have to partner with them so that our voices, become legitimate. And I think I see behind you, you have George Jackson's book, Blood in My Eye. And I think one of the problems that I've seen a lot with indigenous studies, indigenous struggles, is oftentimes we create a not okay, there's a perfect victim, right? That we I think your politics of appeal is really important, because the appeal has to happen to somebody, right? And so we create an imagined audience of ostensibly white liberals, that this is their palette, this is what they like, these are the words that they use, this is the affect that they appreciate. There's but at the end of the day, I think what you're talking about here is almost this kind of sense of charity, a charity relationship in terms of they control all the cards, they control all the resources, they have the biggest military, they have research money, they have the time and the leisure to go in and out of these places. um, but also, as we're seeing, there is an aid economy that's created to create dependence, that also instructs and disciplines narrative. I'm assuming, based on your own experience, growing up in Jerusalem and your struggles in Sheikh Jarrah, there's an attempt to control that narrative, right? So not that it appeals to the politics of appeal shouldn't be towards Palestinian society, but this imagined like Western audience, right? And I think that's what you're really talking about when you say there's a settler in your head, and there is. As writers, we have to write to an audience. And what is your audience in this? Like, who are you appealing to when you write this book? Because there is an appeal, there is an audience that you're imagining in your head, as you write these things.
Well, there was an intended audience, and there was, the real audience. Like I made an intent, like I made a conscious decision. I told myself, I'm writing this as though I'm writing to a friend, and meaning I refuse to think of my readers as people who are suspicious of me. I know that the ADL has a copy of the book for sure, and I know that they're gonna write something about it, condemning it, blah blah blah. But I can't write with the ADL in my head. I can't write because that will hinder me. That will make me rely too much on the voices of quote unquote experts, as you mentioned, and it'll make me feel watched as I'm writing. And I think it's much more dignified and much more compelling to talk as though you're talking to a friend, as though you're talking to someone who is not suspicious of you, who is just curious and eager to listen and wants to help. Um, but obviously, and of course, despite my intentions, I'm sure there are many parts where I, somehow still address the settler or still address the settler's concerns or still address the settler's accusations. I'm sure that it's like the book is riddled with it, but the intention was to kind of approach this, what Toni Morrison calls the sovereignty, like to approach it with like a sense of sovereignty over my work. Because I don't know, I think a lot about my experience reading books about Palestine in English, and how sometimes I felt insulted by them, despite their great intentions, and despite like me telling myself and knowing, oh, this is not written for me. Sometimes I wanted to think of the young Palestinian reader, or even the young, any marginalized person who's not suspicious. I wanted to think of their experience reading this book because I don't know. We don't really address each other as an audience all that often, and I didn't want to neglect them, and I didn't want to neglect like ourselves.
Yeah, and I was pointing out Blood in Your Eye because George Jackson is writing to his brother Jonathan, right? But we learn so much, and I feel like some of these appeals, your appeals, are to your friends, and you're even talking about your friends. It scales up. It's your intimate relationships with your colleagues, your friends, your family, but then also the industry in general, but also people who you see on their faces, right? You're talking about, in one instance, standing outside, I don't know what it was, like some award ceremony and the New York Times was hosting it, but then seeing obviously recognizable Muslim people, Muslim journalists walk out of these places and put on literal blinders, and when I think about that scene, I see, we see it a lot of times. It's like oftentimes people think of this kind of binary of like the settler and the native, and on one side there's the native and the settler, but in native society it's not homogenous. It's very split. Within our communities, people believe different things. They may be against the colonial structure, but they're like pro-capitalist and they want to exploit. They want to be landowners, or they're like, whatever, they're liberals or they're Democrats or they're um, they could be, far left, they could be, traditionalists, they could be all kinds of various things. But there's a way in which, when we enter the master's narrative, when we're using these words, when we're engaged in these spaces, how we are taught to not see each other and to not recognize and to deny our own humanity, because our recognition is based on the institutions that we work for, and not just the resources they provide, but the idea that their recognition of our humanity thus validates us being in these in these places. And so when we see our own people outside protesting the very thing that we're supporting and that we're writing for, we have to shut it off, right? So I guess, like, my question around that is, I hate this, like, oh, what's the solution? But, like, what is a writer, who finds themselves in these legacy institutions, whether that's the New York Times, whether it's, they're a well-known poet, because sometimes I read things and I'm like, this person is expressing raw emotion here, but they're doing it in such a way that almost decontextualizes,
Defeat some.
right, right.
I think it's an extremely difficult question to answer, especially when you consider, of course, some people are careerists and opportunists and whatever, but sometimes we're talking about people's livelihoods. My view is that there is nothing more powerful than staying with your group and then staying with the collective. If there's a newspaper that says the Palestinian people don't exist, the Palestinian people are liars, their death toll is fabricated, they are terrorists, they hide behind human shields, and we refuse them, we refuse to, we've invisibilized them from our standards, we don't mention them, we talk about them in passive tense, but you, this one, just one Palestinian individual, you are welcome. And we invite you along, despite you're different than the rest of your people. You're a prodigy. The rest of your people are invisible. They don't exist. They're liars. They're terrorists. But you're great, and we accept you. I think it's far more powerful to say no. Actually, I'm going to stick with the group. I'm going to refuse this flawed hospitality you're offering me, because systemically you're participating in the eradication of my people. But what happens is that we offer our likeness to these institutions, and there's this kind of like naive belief that like somebody reading our op-ed in this legacy media is going to change their mind about Palestine. And this is fundamentally because we still believe and we're still occupied by the prestige that these authorities, these institutions have. The authority we assign it is massive, and we're kind of like, in Arabic we say بحمل السلم بالعرض, like we're carrying the ladder horizontally. We're acting nonsensical because in one stroke we're telling we're saying to people the New York Times is biased, it's racist, it discriminates against Palestinians in its coverage, but in the other breath we celebrate it when it gets something right, and we're so eager to be published by it. And we should really be expelling and dismantling and undermining these institutions' prestige from our minds, and think about better how to serve our communities, how to serve our collectives, and how to empower our own initiatives. I think that's a far better approach. And also, like you said, poets and writing about feelings. I think, and somewhere in the book, I try to make like kind of a humorous observation that I think it's us, the poets, who like have who everybody can agree on the poets. There's like liberal Zionists, and by poets I mean poets and artists and whatever, but like liberal Zionists, Democrats, liberals, academics, scholars. There's always, when they're talking about Palestine, there's always Mahmoud Darwish. There's always like a poet in the mix. And it's because in a lot of ways poetry can be decontextualized, it can be defanged, it can be depoliticized. And they're quoting the Mahmoud Darwish who like says something about the skies or about Jasmine. They're not quoting the Mahmoud Darwish who says, but if I hunger, I eat the flesh of my rapist. They're not quoting the Mahmoud Darwish that says, be aware of my anger. They're not quoting the Mahmoud Darwish that is vengeful, is telling the Israelis to be expelled from our midst. They're quoting this. And this happens also when the artists migrate and they go to the New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever, because a lot of the time, yes, it's a Palestinian on the byline, but the editor will so often mutilate the piece that is getting published and remove from it any politics, any kind of militancy that would like inspire in the reader anything but pity. And I don't think pity is a productive framework.
Hmm. And yeah, pity itself is a form of domination and oppression, because you can only be pitied, right? And I think you talk about the resistance fighter as somebody who is completely demonized and misrepresented, um, and is outside the bounds, right? You often say, I've heard you speak several times, that we have to raise the ceiling, and I wonder like what that means in terms of our conversations around resistance, and resistance fighters, because you cannot in this media landscape just get objective facts. You can't just read a news story to understand like there are clear, reasons why people resist, an armed struggle exists. It's just completely irrationalized. It's like, it's made to be this irrational sort of response. On That's on one hand, and the other hand, to kind of speak to what you were saying about the poets and the writers, there are like Palestinian, you can buy a copy of Mein Kampf on Amazon, but you can't buy a copy of Yahya Sinwar's, The Carnation and the Rose, um, because one is considered more vile, and I don't know, he's just considered so abject that you would not be able to look at a piece of art that he had written, like a novel. I think it's two novels. I haven't read it. I haven't read all of it, I should say, but it's two novels. But you can't access that. Or even for us, we were the Red Media. Our organization was put on a watch list because we had on one of our reading lists of books that we donated to incarcerated relatives and tribal schools on reservations. It was Ghassan Ghanafani's Palestine's Children, like, and he, because he was the Secretary General of the PFLP, he was considered a terrorist too. And so even if he's writing about children, that has to be banned, and that's going to put you on a watch list, and we're going to go after your funding, we're going to try to delegitimize you, we're going to demonetize you, all these things. So like even in the context of like getting one facts, but also trying to understand, even through an artistic expression, motivations, or not just motivations, not just intent, but the kind of full spectrum of humanity, that is also censored. And all you're left with is, you can either be a victim or a terrorist. Like that's it. Like there's no middle ground.
Yeah, and it's like you said, it's kind of like they need you to be in line with the world order that they have created for you before they even listen to you. We see this in like even in the well-meaning press interviews. We see this in our media representation and like activist discussions. The example that I like to use often is Christian Amanpour like interviewing an Israeli journalist and saying, do you think Palestinians deserve human rights? And then she quickly corrects herself and she says, and I'm not talking about Hamas, somehow saying that if you are a supporter of Hamas or if you are Hamas or whatever, then the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is no longer universal when it comes to you. It does not apply to you. And that this kind of like racism is so normalized. This kind of demonization of the Palestinians is so normalized. And so what I mean by like raising the ceiling is, I think the threshold of Israel's brutality has only been exceeded, and the ceiling of what can be said by Palestinians has only been lowered. And you think it would be the opposite. And so I'm asking those of us in the public eye, those of us who are visible, those of us who have access, who are institutionally backed, to put the average student in their mind when they're speaking and say, will what I'm saying make it easier for the average student to express themselves? Will it make it easier for my grandmother to express herself? Or will what I'm saying make it harder? because I get it. We're all, people are scholars and academics, and they're smart and they know the law, and they know the right words. But I think sometimes it's far more powerful to not care about the sanitized, polite, bulletproof words, and to actually make discursive, quote unquote, errors or missteps, because that raises the ceilings for other people, the people who are emotive, or the people who say, I hope Zionists die in a moment of fury, or the people who say, I hate them, or the people who don't make the distinction, or, people who just aren't, are too busy surviving airstrikes and bullets to learn, a Western ethnocentric script and a way of being. And so my approach is irreverence, and the belief I have is a belief in dignity. If this whole debate is set up to be an investigation, it's set up to be an interrogation, it's set up to be a cross-examination, then it's better to reject it. It's better to reject this cross-examination, to question the authority of the people who've set up themselves as judges to test our character. Sure, I can tell you that I can tell you that I'm not anti-Semitic. I can defend myself against your accusations against me, and I can prove to you that I know the distinction, that I know the tropes, that I know this, and I know the history, and I know that, and blah blah blah, and I have Jewish friends, and blah blah blah. But also, I can tell you, who are you to accuse me of this, and why should I answer to you, and why should we address what's in my heart, supposedly, when we're talking about tanks on the ground, when we're talking about airplanes in the sky bombarding people? Why is that systemic killing secondary to my feelings? It's absurd.
So we have a question from Marian Eberhardt. Given the Zionist propagandists $150 million to further demonize Palestinian voices that no other land is winning is significant. I'm not sure that question really
I wonder
that
if
makes sense to you.
she's asking if there's any like significance in no other land, considering that
Ah,
the Israelis
gotcha.
increased their budget. I think, yeah, I think, sure, yes, of course. I think people should learn about Masafer Yatta, and if no other land is the vehicle through which people are learning about Masafer Yatta and are getting involved in Masafer Yatta, then so be it. Yani, sure, there is, um, but I don't know if the Oscar. This is like, it depends on how much merit you assign the Oscar, how much heft you assign the Oscars, or these kinds of like recognition, these kind of symbolic gestures, because the Masafriyata is very much still under risk, and I don't know. But I think I want to thank you for mentioning that the budget for propaganda this year from the Ministry, I think, of Foreign Affairs or Strategic Affairs, is $150 million, which I don't know, but it's certainly way, 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 way more than it was. And it's a scary development, because that means we're going to be seeing a lot more mouthpieces for the Israeli regime and for Zionism. And that means that we are going to need, and we're going to be encountering a lot of this kind of red herrings, these distractions, these kind of Haspora talking points over and over again, because now there's quadruple the funding for it. But I want to be optimistic and also point out that without any budget and without any political, you know, representation, and without any governmental support, we still won the media war, and we still won the narrative war. So I think there comes a point where their image in media is cannot be rehabilitated. This doesn't mean that we should just like put our hands up and say, the moral arc of the universe bends towards the side of justice. It does, but it's because we push it towards that way. So of course we should be vigilant about like the propaganda efforts that are coming, but also I do think we have the truth on our side.
Hmm. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that we have a GoFundMe account, our GoFundMe campaign for Red Media. Please donate below. There will be a link posted in the chat. For those of you who want to make a one-time donation, we are independent media. We don't get large donor-funded money. We don't get money from the big foundations. It's all user and membership donations. It's the $2 a month donations that keep this podcast running. And if you want to support us on Patreon, it's patreon.com/Red Media PR. You're listening to this live broadcast with Mohammed el-Kurd, who's talking about his book, Perfect Victims. And, as we wrap up, Mohammed, I just want to, ask, I have like two questions. One is, what are you reading right now? I look at your bookshelf, and for me, my bookshelf has changed. And I was just in a conversation with Jared Ball about this. October 7th changed my bookshelf. It clarified in my mind what I should be reading and what needs to be read and what needs to be, elevated. The second one is, I guess, your writing practice. Like, how do you're a poet, but you wrote this, book of nonfiction. What was that? What was that like?
I think writing, I think writing is torture.
It is. It's so
Worst thing
bad.
ever. Um, I think there's this clip of Anthony Bourdain, I think, who was like, he was saying that, I think writers or academics or whatever complain too much about their work being hard, and they should go stand behind the kitchen table and like clean squid for 2 hours, and they'll see how easy writing is. And I disagree with him. I think I'd rather clean squid than write. It's like really a tumultuous task, particularly because you're like, I recognize that because there's so little representation of Palestinians, that my voice is not necessarily mine, and that I have to keep so many other people in mind while I'm writing. And I think this makes it harder because you're like writing for a collective, but it also makes it much more fulfilling and much more beautiful because there's so many different people whose inputs really like uplift your work. But I'm a very, very slow writer. Uh, I'll answer you about what I'm reading right now, but I'm also really interested in your answer about how October 7th changed your bookshelf. I'm reading Blood in My Eye right now. I'm rereading it because I'm just really like, I'm obviously enamored with George Jackson, but I'm so fascinated by how he talks about prestige and how he like, you know, identifies prestige as this dangerous thing that exists in society that is like one of the least talked about aspects of this whole thing of movement work and who do you write for and so on. We never talk about prestige really. When we talk about the New York Times and why we write for the New York Times, we say it's because of the readership. And so the prestige is this unspoken thing. So I've just been reading Blood in My Eye, but I'm really curious to know how your bookshelf has changed.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is on my bookshelf. I actually read George Jackson, I think maybe a month after October 7th, 2023. And it helped me like think about, he's a very efficient writer at getting his point across. He doesn't mince words. He's very clear. And I think there's sort of a purity in that approach. I guess like it's a what Lara Sheehy calls a militant clarity that we have gained. And it's I've been rereading some of the classics in American Indian studies, like Elizabeth Cook Lynn. She writes a lot about, she wrote a lot about anti-imperialism from an indigenous perspective, and she was really criticized for it during her time. And there's a reason why we don't know her name. We there's a reason why we know other indigenous scholars' names and not others. Some of it is because of their merits, but some of it is also because of what they were saying was running against the current of American imperialism. And I think we have to embrace them as our own. And so I also been thinking a lot about writers as relatives in my mind, and like how I'm writing, with them and thinking with them. And I very much see your book as part of that kind of community of thinking. And yeah, I guess, thanks so much, Mohammed. I know you have to run soon, but just one last question. I, there's this conversation between indigenous and native people in North America and Palestine, and what's the best way for Palestinian community to support our struggles for decolonization? What's the best way for our community to support your struggles for decolonization? That's a big question to end on, but
Um, I think you guys do a little bit more than than we do, but maybe this is me being like self-critical. I think we know I think we know the basics in Palestine, but I think there can be a lot done for us to acquire a far more profound political education. But also, I think um, I don't know, like the Israelis in certain, or maybe in one, I don't want to say certain. I don't know if it's more than one, but I at least know of one incident where the Israeli government like went to a reservation and they like funded a cultural exchange program or whatever because both people are indigenous and they could, they
They've
could.
done more than one. I can, I can confirm that. Yeah.
And I think we can find a way to do something similar. We certainly don't have the resources, but like this is, I don't know if I should. I was talking to a friend who was planning a delegation to certain reservations, and even for me, like I considered myself a person who knew fairly, a little bit about Native American history. When I went the first time to a pueblo in New Mexico, like it it just it showed me how much, like, it really made me feel with such urgency how much we need to be working together and we need to be talking to each other. I know this is like a non-answer, but the answer is I hope, that we're. I know we say, like, people say like we're too busy surviving, or like we each have our own troubles, but I do think it is really worth the while to talk to each other more. Certainly, like this podcast and the Red Nation has always been a window for me and for others. But also, I'm just thinking about how we can uh, collaborate more, and it's an open conversation.
Well, thanks so much, Mohammed, for joining the podcast. You can pick up Perfect Victims, haymarketbooks.com. Check it out. Where can people follow you on social media?
If you just type my name on Instagram and Twitter, you'll probably find my page. But it's okay. I'm insufferable online. Just read the book; it's better. Um, Thank you, Nick, for having me. I just want to say it's such an honor. I'm a huge, huge, huge fan of your work. I've like admired it for many years. So it's like such an honor. I know it's not my first time be on the podcast, but when I saw your endorsement of the book, it was like such a huge honor for me. So I really appreciate it, and I appreciate your time and interest in the book and interviewing me today. Thank you.
Well, it was an honor that you all reached out to ask me for a blurb. So thank you so much, Mohammed.